I am delighted to introduce our guest for the evening, Hank Millward. I've heard Hank speak multiple times over the years, and every time I hear him speak, I learn something new. To quote Scott Brabrand, I take away lots and lots of nuggets from Hank. Hank has a very long title. He'll tell you, but he's the director of the Virginia Department of Education, Department of Special Education and Student Services, Office of Specialized Education Facilities and Family Engagement. And I probably messed that up. So Hank, why don't you take it away? We'll get your PowerPoint up and running. And I am absolutely delighted that we have Hank with us this evening.
Thank you, Michelle.
You know what we're also going to do, we're going to have, if folks have questions for Hank, please put them in the chat and we will collect them all on a document so he doesn't have to be following along with that. And then after he finishes his presentation, we'll read them back out to him. Is that right, Amanda?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Okay, Hank, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. Again, thank you, Michelle, for inviting me on tonight. I always enjoy getting out and talking to any kind of constituency group, and more importantly, I love talking with parents about special education laws and regulations, and to share information that I believe is very necessary and important for them as they continue to advocate for their child, because I can't stress it enough that a parent is the most important advocate for their child and need to know what they need to know in order to do that effectively. So if I can impart any kind of nugget, as Michelle mentioned tonight, then I will feel that I've accomplished what I was brought here to do tonight. Michelle introduced me as the director of an office of facilities and family engagement here at the Department of Education. I've been at the department 17 years. I've been the director of the office for about going on the 4th year now. And I have been involved with working with families for almost the 17 years that I've been at the department, working with parents, not only in disputes, but also in trying to inform them of their rights and within the laws and regulations. So I'm not going to get into a long biography that's really irrelevant to tonight, but I will say that I'm enjoying the opportunity to be here. And I will just throw this caveat out that I am not here today because of anything that we at the department feels needs to be shared directly because of anything going on in Fairfax County. This is a request made by your SEPTA to share some certain information about recovery service. It is not attached to any kind of corrective action or anything of that regard. This is just a presentation by me regarding the department's position on recovery services. And with that, I will be talking about a few other things as well. But Michelle, if you could let me share my screen, we'll bring up the PowerPoint. And then also I wanted to say, Michelle said, if you got questions, put them in the chat and we will answer as many of those as we can tonight. The ones we can answer, that I won't answer tonight, given the fact that they may be tied to a specific student or may require me to do a little bit more brainstorming within my own brain or with my colleagues, I will respond back to Michelle, and then she can share that response through whatever channel she has to do that. So.
And Amanda, I actually am having a hard time making Hank a co-host. I'm wondering if you can help me out with that.
I don't need to be a co-host. I just need to share my screen. I mean, you can make me a host if you want, and we'll have.
Yeah, I think that's the way that we have to do it. So
we'll have
bear with us
and
for
milk,
a sec
here. That kind of thing.
Should be done.
There we go. Okay, you should have that option now.
Yes. Which part of my screen do I want to share? This one. All right. All right. As I said, I'm here tonight to talk about recovery services. What are they and when are they appropriate? But again, I want to stress that I cannot answer any student-specific questions in this format. So if you've got a what if type question, that'll be fine. But please do not do any identification of personally identifiable information through this platform. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I'm thinking, well, there really isn't a whole half an hour, 45 minutes of information about recovery services, but I thought it was important that we talk about a few other things. So what I'm planning to do tonight is kind of refresh everybody about what is free and appropriate public education in this time of COVID, talk a little bit about COVID itself and its impact on FAPE, but then I really want to explore the differences between compensatory services, extended school year services, and recovery services, because in working with parents across the Commonwealth, myself and the other two individuals in my office, Tracy Lee and Gloria Dalton, we get a lot of questions about what should I be asking for? Should I be asking for a compensatory service? Should I be asking for extended school year? Should I be asking for recovery? So hopefully tonight I will provide some clarification on what is the difference between those three, and a parent can then make a more informed decision on which one may be most appropriate given their student's current situation. But I wanted to cover FAPE real quick because when this whole thing started with the COVID and the closing of schools and people were talking about my child is not getting a free appropriate public education, we had to remind people that, yeah, the key word in FAPE, and I'm not going to read this definition of FAPE, everybody knows what the regulations say, but the key word in free appropriate public education is what? And I know if I was in a live session, somebody would probably yell out free, but we all know that the key word in free appropriate public education is truly the word appropriate. And what may have been appropriate pre-COVID may not look the same as it does in the COVID situation and now post-COVID. Things are going to look a little bit different. That's not to say that children should not be receiving the services that they need, but it may look a little different in its delivery or in the amount of services or the type of services that the child's receiving. And how do you determine appropriate is obviously through an IEP team discussion and an agreement between the parent and the school division on what constitutes a free appropriate public education in general, and specifically during this time of COVID and recovery from COVID, with schools opening in virtual and hybrid, and some are still closed, no in-person learning at all. So lots of different things play into what is appropriate for a student with a disability. But I also want to stress that the regulations governing special education programs for children with disabilities in Virginia, what I lovingly refer to as the Purple Book, have not been suspended, waived, or modified. So everything that's in that regulation is still effective and still applicable during this time of COVID, and all of the procedural safeguards and things that are accompanied within that regulation must be adhered to as we work through determining what services should a child receive, and if appropriate, what services would they qualify for, either through compensatory, extended school year, or recovery. So we'll be keeping that in mind as we discuss. And again, I stress that the key word in FAPE is appropriate, but that last bullet on this slide where it says FAPE must be individualized is probably the most important of the whole thing. There we go. So let's talk about compensatory services first, because that is the one most people are familiar with. But there is a difference between compensatory services and recovery services. And I know there is some disagreement on that. And I'm not going to say that recovery services aren't somewhat compensating, but they are not considered the same when we're looking at what type of service and what should be looked at when we're determining the service itself. And one of the things with compensatory services that's always been a question, even before the COVID time, is what are compensatory services? And what happened? Hold on a second. I'm having technical difficulties today. So compensatory services are not defined in either IDA or nor the regulations governing special education programs for children with disabilities in Virginia. So it's really up to an IEP team to determine what does compensatory services look like. And most often compensatory services are coming out of some acknowledgement of a dispute or a failure on the school division to do something related to the provision of the FAPE through the IEP or some other procedural violation of the regulations, such as maybe a evaluation or the provision of an IEE or things like that. But when you're talking about compensatory services, you also need to remember they're not contractual. They're about making things equitable and making sure that children are getting what they may have missed by the failure of a school division to provide a certain service. The other thing to remember about compensatory services, that it's not required to be a day for day or minute for minute makeup. If an allegation is that a student didn't get their full 40 hours a month of speech services, the compensatory services may equate out to only 20. But that's also not to say that the compensatory services couldn't be more than the 40. There's no obligation or regulatory requirement that talks about it having to be day for day or minute for minute as far as making up and compensating for missed services. And there is no minimum or maximum level that must be provided. So again, it's an IEP team decision. We'll talk about all of this a little bit more in depth as we move on. So, as I said, the purpose of compensatory services is to remedy a failure to provide a child with a disability when appropriate services was or is entitled to receive a free appropriate public education. So right here, I want to talk about the difference between a failure and an inability. A failure is, you know, you have to do something, it's scheduled to have been done, and it wasn't provided. In the case of COVID, and some people think I'm a little too simplistic when I try to equate it to this, it's somewhat like a school closure due to a snow day. The school is closed and no one is receiving services. So if in the time of COVID, if the school was not providing any services to any student, then they would not be obligated to provide services to a child with a disability in accordance with their IEP, because the school was technically closed. It's not that the school was closed and not operating like they did eventually. Some schools opened up with some online learning, and then some went even quickly into hybrid learning. But when they're not providing any instruction at all to any student, then that really isn't an LEA's failure to provide services. The school's closed and there's no obligation to provide such services to a student with a disability as outlined in the IEP. And that would be things such as, like I said, the IEP itself, or evaluations, or any other violations of special education laws and regulations that impact on the provision of FAPE. And I know I'll probably get a couple of questions to clarify that, but I wanted to take a moment to try and explain that there is a difference between a school closure and a school being operating under different parameters, which many schools have been doing since March of 2020. So how do we figure out when a child might need compensatory services? Well, we always stress at the department that you should be working with your local school division team, which would be your IEP team and your administrators within the building, and come up with some collaborative decision making and determining what might be required. And often that is done obviously through an IEP team, but compensatory services can also be awarded through a mediated agreement, a state complaint findings, or a due process hearing decision. So there are several ways to determine what might be needed or that compensatory services are needed. So if they're going to be provided as a denial of FAPE, your IEP team needs to meet and determine the type of services and the frequency and duration. It's an IEP team determination, although there is nothing that prevents a school division and the parent from agreeing to the provision of compensatory services through an IEP addendum, especially if it's over a small period of time or whatever. So that takes me to any questions that people might have on the compensatory services. If we want to answer some of those now, or we can wait until the end. Which do you prefer, Michelle?
That is a fine question. I have been copying and pasting the questions over, and I actually haven't divided them up that way. So if you hold on for 1 second here.
I mean, we can wait and do them all at the end, but.
Give me a sec. Let me see. One question that potentially could fall under compensatory if we talk about appropriate is, what do you need to prove in order to say that virtual is not appropriate?
Wow, that's a tough question. It's all individualized and based on the student's needs. I mean, and the IEP team needs to sit and work out and discuss why that's not appropriate in the parent's perspective and possibly in the school's perspective, and also from the student's perspective, if the student can vocalize what is going on and what they need in the virtual environment. There is no cut and dried answer to say, well, it's appropriate for this student, it's not appropriate for another. It's all, as we all know in special ed, individualized on the student's needs based on their disability. I mean, there are certainly some students whose disabilities certainly do not bode well potentially to a virtual environment, but then there's others that could do quite well with that environment due to the lack of distractions and so on. So I'm going to leave that one out as an IEP type decision. And if the person asking that question has a specific student in mind, they can certainly reach out to me and we can talk about it from an individual student perspective.
All right, from looking at the questions, I think actually it would make sense for you to just go on with recovery, because I think that many of the questions
are going to go
do
there.
With, well, and which is it? What are we looking at here?
Gotcha. All right. So I'll just skip over these questions that pop up every now and then. All right. So
yeah, we'll continue to collect them into our question sheet.
That sounds like a plan. All right, so let's talk about extended school year services, because when this first came out, a lot of people were talking about, well, we'll just provide extended school years to everybody, or my students should get extended school year services because they didn't get all the services that they were entitled to due to COVID. Well, that's not the purpose of extended school year. Extended school year, as the definition and the regulations define, is providing a student with a disability instruction beyond the normal school year. And we know that this has not been a normal school year last year, nor will this year be, with all the different changes in movement and the constant moving of the bar, with what schools can do, should do, must do in order to compensate for the COVID-19 and the CDC requirements for social distancing and so on. So again, extended school year is about beyond what has been the normal year and is designed to be considered when there are anticipated breaks, such as the summer, such as the winter break, the spring breaks. All those things that we know are going to happen is when you would be looking at extended school year, because you're extending the school year to provide this child with services, because the IEP team has determined that the child needs the additional services and supports, because without it, what they've gained during the school year will be jeopardized significantly if extended school years are not provided. And I highlighted the key phrases there. Only if a child's IEP team determines on an individual basis and must be significantly jeopardized. In other words, if the kid doesn't get some additional services over the break, when he comes back, he's going to either have fallen behind or will need significant instruction to regain any lost instruction. And again, you can see there's correlations between losing services because of COVID, and we're going to get to recovery, I promise. But in this situation, we're talking about extended school year, because right now, if we don't do something and we know we're going to be closing over the summer, to use an example, then we need to be looking at, does extended school year apply in order to ensure that the child's going to continue to receive a free, appropriate public education. And again, I don't need to really get into too much of this. This is all basic regulations, but again, you can't limit extended school year service to a particular category of disability or typical type of student. You can't limit the type, the amount, duration of those, and you can't limit the extended school year service to only the summer. So again, as we look at other breaks coming up, we will have a spring break and we will have some other breaks, I'm sure, but we're not talking about breaks in school that are caused by a closure of the school and a change in the delivery of services from in-person to potentially a hybrid or to a full virtual type setup. We're talking about where the school is technically over, the school calendar here is impacted, and we're filling in the gap because of those anticipated scheduled breaks. And again, the regulations clearly are stating that it's determined on an individual basis, and there shouldn't be a blanket, well, we're going to do extended school year for all students, nor should a parent expect that just because my student is behind that he's going to qualify for extended year, because he may be behind because he may need the recovery services we're going to talk about. So, and then again, the IEP team must convene as early as possible to determine what impact the break in school is going to be met or needed, so that if there is a dispute there, the parent could seek resolution of the dispute through mediation or state complaint or a due process hearing. Okay, ESY services themselves are not compensatory or recovery, and ESY cannot be used in place of COVID recovery services. And everybody keep in mind that these are not just Hank's thoughts. These are things that are coming right out of the resources that I'm going to share with you at the end, like our COVID recovery document and our recovery design and so on documents that we'll talk about. And then ESY services are necessary because the benefit the child gains during the regular school year, again, will be significantly jeopardized by not having the services provided. So on to the topic of tonight, recovery services. What are they? Well, one, they are not ESY services, although they may occur during the breaks in the LEA's academic calendar. Okay, there's nowhere, that's nothing in the guidance or nothing regulatory that says that recovery services have to be provided in the summer, or they can't be provided at any other time during the school year as an after school service or during some of those other scheduled breaks in the academic calendar. And then, as we've talked about, the IDA provides compensatory service when there's a denial of FAPE, and the compensatory is offered by the school division to address a loss of service due to COVID should be referred to as COVID recovery services. So they do kind of attach together compensatory and recovery, but what we're trying to stress through to the department is we should be looking at them differently. Compensatory being for a complete denial of a school division to fail to provide the services outlined in IEP, and then recovery services for those services that couldn't be delivered due to an extended closure or an extended modification of the delivery of services as a means to just keep kids engaged in the educational process, should be looked at as the recovery type service. We want to recover what the child may have missed due to that extended closure. And we did address this in an FAQ back in 2012, which is technically still relevant, but I didn't want to put it in here tonight because it may raise different questions, because it was more about school closures due to extended closures due to snow and some holidays, and services aren't required to be provided when a school is technically closed. I've already made that point, but there is an FAQ question out there from 2012 that also addresses this.
Hank,
Yeah.
would you please, actually the slide you were just on, would you please just repeat one more time the second part about compensatory versus COVID?
Sure. What I'm saying here, compensatory services are generally offered because the school failed to do something. In other words, they should have done it, they could have done it, the school was open, they could have done it. But with recovery, we're saying, well, it wasn't really the fault of the school that they couldn't do it. The school was closed. And I mean closed, nobody got instruction, nobody got anything. They just couldn't do that. But because it was an extended period of time, that certainly is going to impact on all students, not just students with special needs, but we would want to recover the lost learning that would have occurred during those closures. Does that make more sense? I said it a little differently than I did the first time.
I think so. Why don't you just keep going? Thank you.
Okay. So, and again, our guidance is saying that, yeah, the term compensatory services is generally attached to the provision of additional special education reserve due to the failure of a school division to provide FAPE. And then the child's IEP team should be determining what impact the extended school closure due to COVID had on the ability of the school division to provide even any kind of comparable services to students with disabilities, and then determine what, if any, recovery service should be provided based on individual student needs. And again, not every student is going to need recovery services, and we'll talk about why that is true here as we move through these other slides. But the emphasis here again is you can call it compensatory services and not really be wrong, because you're compensating for the closure of the school. But to draw a finer line and kind of keep things in line, we're saying let's call these recovery services. And we're not the only state doing it. Other states are using a similar term or some other term to define the difference between a failure and an inability to provide services, and still recognize that because it was such an extended closure or still in extended periods of different services or reductions in services, that these kids are going to need at least to be considered for some additional recovery. You could probably even put in the word remedial services to be provided to kind of help bring them back up to speed with what they lost, the learning lost due to the closure. And when you want to look at considering recovery service, you've really got to have a period of time, and there's nothing in regulation or guidance that tells you what period of time needs to be considered, but you got to give the student time to demonstrate where they're weak, what they've missed, and where are those gaps. And the way you do that obviously is through the consideration of individual student data and looking at, you know, what skills need to be recouped and what are the deficits that the student's demonstrating that possibly came from the closure of the school due to the COVID situation or the reduction in the services. And then the IEP team obviously is the one that needs to consider that data and compare that during the extended school closure, and that skill loss and recovery may be varied between grades and subject and students, and every student is going to be impacted totally different. And then also the educational model that was used. So all those things need to be considered. And then again, LEAs are not required to automatically hold an IEP meeting for every student with a disability to talk about recovery services. But the IEP team should consider initiating an IEP team meeting or the parent requesting one when they see there's a lack of expected progress towards the annual goals and the general curriculum. There's results of any new reevaluation data, information about the child shared by the parent, all needs to be addressed, or if the LEA anticipates the child may need the recovery services based on what they're seeing. Must remember that when a parent requests COVID services, this is a request for an IEP team meeting. So if you as a parent are looking to have requested an IEP meeting and it's been denied, then you have a right to receive a response within 10 business days from the time the request is made with what is called the prior written notice. And a prior written notice should contain additional information justifying the refusal and the need to assess student progress. And then again, if the parent requests a meeting to discuss, the IEP team should communicate clearly about the types of data required to address COVID services. And then that takes us again into a lot of questions about what really needs to be looked at. And I kind of mentioned these before. It's actually a repeat, but I think it was so important to stress these 4 points here in red. You're looking at the expected progress versus what the child is actually doing. The big thing is getting the data collected. Is there any reevaluations that were conducted? And then what are the anticipated needs? And again, you got to look at the totality of the circumstances for each student and determine the amount of service needed to remedy it. There shouldn't be a blanket determination or a unilateral predetermination that we're only going to provide services to this certain group of kids. Every student with an IEP team is entitled to have their needs looked at on an individual basis as a provision of the free appropriate public education provisions. Free appropriate public education provisions, excuse me. And then again, when you're looking at recovery services, you've got to look at the strengths of the child, the concerns of the parent, the results of the initial and most recent evaluation data, and the academic development functional needs, just like you would for any other revisions to the IEP. There is nothing new there. That is basic IEP development 101 right there, those 4 points. And then obviously COVID recoveries must comply with those same standards. That's the obvious piece there. And again, this is a statement just to say again that all students may not require the recovery services. And that the IEP team is necessary to determine it. And the key thing that I want to stress here is that the parents may have some additional information that the school division didn't have privy to, especially in the initial part of the COVID, where most time it was the parent trying to provide those, what we call them, continuity of learnings, and some other terms that were used to say, hey, we're providing at least some information and instruction or trying to keep students engaged in their education, but the parents are the ones that were there trying to make all that happen. So they've got information that isn't really privy to the school division until the parent brings it to the table. So it's important that the IEP team ask the parent to, again, explain what they were seeing with their student during the COVID periods of instruction and all these times that are still going on with the in-home learning, the virtual learning, whatever you want to call it, and the hybrid situation. And how is that impacting on their child? What are they seeing? And getting that information into the present level of performance. And then obviously the determination about recovery services may become the subject of a dispute. And if that's the case, then the parent has all of the IDA dispute resolution options available to them: mediation, state complaint, or a due process hearing. And again, how are they determined? I keep stressing this. It's an IEP team decision. Student performance and data pre-COVID, student participation performance during COVID, and their performance upon returning of the school. You can't make a determination of recovery services and what a child may need without considering all three of those key points. So, and again, what period of time is necessary? It's going to vary between some students versus another. We've been back to school technically since September, but not all students have been in person. So there's still that impact on the virtual learning that needs to be considered. There's been reduction in services because of the virtual learning. All of those things are still in play. And the IEP team needs to take a look at all of that data and make a determination on an individual basis of what constitutes the need for, if any, for recovery services. And then we want to look at these type of things when we're looking at data: observations, samples of the student work pre and post and during COVID, any behavior logs for students with disabilities that have behavior issues, screenings and assessments and parent interviews and questions and observations. But also, again, we don't want to forget about getting information from the student themselves, especially those that can articulate their needs. And then again, we talk about gathering informal and curriculum-based measures to determine baselines. And one of the things we pointed out in our recovery document that the data is going to inform instructional planning and is not considered a formal evaluation and therefore does not require parental consent. Review of IEP goals and progress to compare to pre-COVID closure data, and then the educational data from classroom instruction, benchmarks, and correctional and curriculum-based learning. And then the key too is we stress that this trauma of COVID and the disruption is going to make the use of standardized norm reference tests potentially inappropriate to measure progress in some students. So don't be alarmed as a parent if the school says, we don't believe we need to do any standardized testing. We've got enough data available without it, because it may be inappropriate, may be skewed due to these things that are mentioned there, the trauma and just the disruption. And though the use of standardized reference measures to determine is not recommended, it's not prohibited. So again, if there is a deemed need, then certainly the school division can do a more formalized assessment. But if they do go to the formal assessment, they need to remember, and you as a parent need to remember, that you need to provide your consent with a prior written notice prior to giving your consent to that standardized testing. And I've already stressed this, that parental input is key and must be considered and should be reflected into the prior written notice that it was considered. And then again, because COVID recovery service, much like compensatory service or equitable remedy, your IEP team has the flexibility to create any fashion of services they deem would be appropriate for addressing the need for additional service to a student with a disability that was impacted by the COVID closures. And again, I mentioned this earlier, documenting the parent's concern is critical. And then they can be limited in time and scope, and therefore the student's progress should be closely monitored and the data should be collected in the manner in which it's identified in the IEP. So COVID services are just like any other services that you put into a child's IEP. It should be determined on what's going to be delivered, what's the progress going to look like, how's it going to be monitored, what are the goals to be expected, and what are the objectives of the provision of the services themselves. And then this slide just reminds everybody about what's required in the prior written notice should the school division IEP team determine that COVID services are or are not required. Oftentimes we forget that a prior written notice is still required even if we all agree on what should be provided. So making sure that you're getting that prior written notice that outlines what you did agree upon, and that also appears within the child's IEP. I've already mentioned the part about being able to use dispute resolution if there's a disagreement between the LEA and the parent. And that is going to take me to the final part of my presentation, which is resources. And as I said, none of this is a Hankism. All of this has come out of these different documents. And these all link. If you will get a copy of this, you can link on these and it'll take you right to each one of these resources on our webpage. So that will take me to the final question and answer. So I guess that's now we can look at what you got in the chat.
Okay, so I'm going to make a full confession here. I have been having a very hard time focusing and digesting everything you said while also capturing questions. So we have a lot of questions, and I'm just going to run through them and we'll see how many we can plow through. We have over 30 questions. And so I apologize if I ask you a question that you sort of had just already answered because my brain just isn't able to process it all. So bear with me, Hank, all right?
All right.
Okay.
I'm here for you.
Oh, it's fantastic. All right.
Take a deep breath.
That's usually my line that I give to people.
It's all good. You deserve a chocolate covered strawberry. You're doing fine.
All right. So let's see. Okay. So sort of to start here for some clarification. True or false might almost be the best way to put this. Hold on, I want to word it correctly, bear with me. Recovery services can only be granted due to Virginia school closures between March and June.
No.
And recovery services are not applicable for services that couldn't be delivered during virtual or hybrid.
No. Recovery services are designed to be provided due to the break and the impact that COVID is having on the student. Yes, the impact was more substantial from March to June because schools were closed and school divisions were determining, well, how are we going to provide? What are we going to provide? Are we going to provide any instruction to any student? Are we only going to provide some sort of continuity of instruction to students? And if so, making sure that we're providing comparable services, that's where recovery service would apply there. But the impact of COVID is continuing with these school divisions that are still doing just hybrid or they're doing only virtual, that there's an impact that could potentially on an individual basis qualify a student for any of the three services that I talked about tonight, but more appropriate probably would be recovery because we're talking about the school's inability to provide the services of the IEP due to an impact created by COVID. It's not like the school looked at the IEP and said, we're not going to do that. They looked at the IEP and said, we're going to do it this way, but that's really not meeting what the IEP says. So is there an impact on FAPE? Yes. Well, is that the failure or is that due to the COVID impact? Did I make sense?
I'm not the one to ask right now with that. Like I said, I'm still digesting, but
okay.
Let's keep going because we have a lot of questions.
Okay.
All right. Guidance that we have received has said that students have to have significantly regressed to receive recovery services. So they're saying if a student has not gained any skills for an entire school year, they do not qualify unless the child regressed.
Well, if they didn't, if they regress, then they may be eligible for extended school year services.
And if they did not regress, are they still eligible for recovery services?
It depends on the individual needs of the student and what the data reflects as far as what did the student lose and where are they at and able to recoup that without any additional instruction.
Okay. Can you clarify whether VDOE includes operating in the virtual setting as school being, quote, open? Like what makes school open or closed?
They're providing instruction, and effective in September, they were supposed to be providing new instruction, and therefore they can do that in the modality that they determine to be most appropriate. The thing you got to keep in mind with all of this COVID situation is every school division has the responsibility to operate their school as they deem it most appropriate given the situations that are impacting on their locality. And that's why we see some schools that were able to readily go to in-person in September, some that went hybrid initially to see where things played and then moved into more in-person. And then we have some that are still fully virtual. So yes, if a school is offering new instruction, then technically school is open, it is not closed.
Okay. Sorry.
The doors are closed, but the school is operational. That's what I tried to say in the beginning, that there's a difference between a school being closed and a school not being operational.
Got it. And actually, why don't I give you a little bit more visual feedback? I'll start my video if you want to end your screen share.
All right, I can
And
do
that way
Yep.
people can see you bigger.
Just what they need to see, me bigger. Yay. All right.
I love you, Hank. All right, let's see. Given that the law is full of procedural safeguards to protect parents, where does it provide information about recovery services? Because it's not in those guidance that parents receive in paper, like the Purple Book. So how are parents supposed to know this all exists?
Looking at those resources that I provided, the COVID recovery document is probably the most relevant one. And then the 3R document is probably the second one. It's where we outlined our guidance. You won't find the term recovery services in any regulation, state or federal. You'll see the term more than likely compensatory. But then we draw in our FAQ that we would like to look at compensatory services that are provided due to an impact of COVID as recovery services.
So how are parents supposed to know about this if they don't know to look at your resources?
Well, I would think that the LEAs are having IEP meetings to discuss the options available. That's where the information would be discussed. So that's how they should get it out. And we have been putting it out. We put it out through our Gov delivery, the information whenever it went out. We put it out that way, and we've shared it not only with the school people, but we shared it directly with parents. So if there's anybody that needs information, we got ways of getting it to the parents, either directly from my office staff or what we continue to do through our Gov delivery. And while I'm on that subject, if parents aren't familiar, if you're not familiar with the Gov delivery, it's a service where you can sign up. It's kind of like receiving a regular email from a vendor saying, hey, this is new information about our products. We do the same thing through Gov delivery. Here's some new information that's impactful for you as a parent. So, and they can sign up with that by accessing the main page of the VDOE website. And the first thing that's going to pop up is, hey, you want to receive information from VDOE, click this link and you can go through and be specific. You want information on XYZ, or you can click the I'll take it all button. I'd be cautious with that button. Because we're putting out information from a lot of different sources. And if you're trying to limit and you only have so much information that you want to receive, you can specify. It's all great information. I wasn't trying to imply that, but you want to, pick and choose what you want to get, at least to try it out. And then if you want to continue to get more, you can always go back and resubscribe.
And I do think that the bottom line of what you said is that the LEA is supposed to be bringing this up in meetings. Does VDOE mandate that LEAs push this information out?
No, we're not mandating. We can only enforce the regulation, and it's not a regulation. We put out the guidance and encourage the school divisions to follow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see.
And I think most school divisions have done a good job of doing it. And again, it's an ever-changing situation. But again, when I say the LEA should be bringing it up, they should be bringing up in a way of answering the parent's question. And that's why I stress that the three processes, making sure you know what you're asking for. Because if you go in saying, hey, I think my student needs compensatory services, well, that's what the IEP team is going to talk about. But, if the school division doesn't believe compensatory services are necessary, then maybe they should mention, well, we could offer some compensatory services. But this is why we do these kind of trainings, to get the word out to parents and have everybody share. You said you had about 200 people that might be hearing this. So if 200 people share it with 200 people, then that's 400 and so on. So that's why we do these.
Yep, we will continue to push it out for sure. Let me move on to more of our questions. I think this one is a little bit more rhetorical in that case. How are schools able to predetermine who or how many students would be eligible for recovery services?
There is no way to predetermine, because everything is based on an individual need.
Exactly.
Student needs.
Exactly. All right. The law contemplated students who did not receive FAPE by creating compensatory services, compensatory education. So I guess this relates to the question that popped up about why aren't the laws just being changed, and why does it seem like the school districts are just going around the law with these recovery services?
I can't speak to that because I don't have any examples of where they may be going around the law. I can't speak to hypotheticals.
That's okay. We'll keep going. How are, and again, some of these may not even.
I told you I'd answer the ones I can and the ones I want to.
That's great. We've got a lot to get through.
Yeah.
And some of them may not directly be related to recovery versus compensatory, but I think that they're the exact questions to shoot to you, so I will. How are asynchronous days allowed to be counted toward minimum days in school?
That's the school division's authority to determine how they're going to provide their instructional modality and how they're going to count that time. There are certain requirements still that haven't been weighed as far as seat time and so on. So all that has to be taken into play. Okay. And all of that is explained in our COVID documents and our guidance documents about what constitutes and what can be weighed and what can be reduced.
Okay. How are, I'm going to go on. Sorry, trying to digest and speak at the same time is a little bit tricky. So when we have the IEP teams making these decisions, and we have, for example, this year where everybody is being schooled virtually, and so teachers are not necessarily knowing their students in the same way or to the same degree. What happens if you can't rely on your team to make decisions because they don't really know your kid?
That's where I stress the part that parental input is probably most critical in this time, because they're the ones that are seeing the student. If they're doing face-to-face virtual learning, then you're going to see some observation, but you're also not seeing the full environment that the child's receiving it in. So that's where it's important that you get input from the parent. But again, everything goes back to the individual needs of the student. And if the parent ends up not agreeing with what the team's deciding, then they certainly have a right to seek mediation or due process or even a facilitated IEP could be an option in some of these cases.
Would you just touch on a facilitated IEP if you did not earlier?
Yeah, a facilitated IEP would be where the school division and the parent agree to have a third-party person come in and facilitate the meeting. They are not there as decision makers. They're not going to interject. They're there to keep the meeting flowing and keeping it on task and keeping it within the regulatory parameters, making sure everybody's got a voice, those kind of things. So it just helps facilitate the process, brings in a little bit more calm maybe to a meeting that's been previously contentious or whatever. But it's a voluntary process on both the part of the parent and the school division. So parent may want it, but the school division doesn't. And we've seen requests that the school division has asked and the parent has declined. So it does work both ways. And it's similar to mediation, other than the fact that there's no agreement. Getting into a facilitated IEP is similar to requesting a mediation because it goes to Art Stewart, but it's a different process. Facilitated IEP meeting is just a facilitation of the meeting itself, no decision making on the part of the facilitator. We're in a mediation. The mediator can help guide that agreement for the parties.
And those facilitators come from?
They're trained by the department, and many of them are prior special ed directors or people that have a long standing within the special education process.
Okay. Oh, and is there a cost to families to have a facilitated meeting?
No cost for facilitation and no cost for mediation, no cost for a state complaint.
Okay. What if I think you sort of just answered this related to due process. What if a parent thinks it's not appropriate, but the school says that virtual is appropriate?
Then they could go to mediation or a due process hearing.
Okay. So the question says, so to check that everyone understands, spring of 2020 is covered by recovery services, but this school year where schools are teaching new material is compensatory services.
Not necessarily. Again, it could be recovery because it's the failure to provide a certain service was due to COVID impact, not a just flat out denial or failure of the school division to provide it. That would be compensatory services or recovery. And again, oftentimes we see that people are using the term recovery and compensatory synonymously. And technically they probably are, but we are trying to draw that distinction of when one is appropriate versus the other. And we're trying to say compensatory services is for a failure and recovery is due to an inability.
Does the money come from different places?
I don't know what money you're talking about.
I'm sorry, for recovery versus compensatory. Like, is one of them out of CARES Act money versus out of the school system's typical funding, or where did the funding come from?
That would be a question to ask of each school division. You know, how are they funding the services?
For recovery services as well.
Recovery and or compensatory or whatever.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I don't get into the finance pieces too much.
Okay. I just didn't know if maybe CARES Act was directly tied to one or the other.
There's money out there for different services, which could be for all students, and then there might be able to use the money for different things.
Okay, got it. If Virginia extends the school year to go into the summer, what does that do in terms of ESY? I guess the question would be, it depends on how long into the summer they push school.
I was going to say, it depends on when you mean by push into the summer. Is there a mandate from the governor we're going to offer summer school? That might be the answer to the question. It's ESY is provided outside of what is the normal school calendar. So if they extend their school year as part of their normal calendar, then ESY service would be provided after that period of time expires as well.
Okay. When parents are looking at hours to try to determine if kids got services or not, does it count as sort of push-in hours when a teacher or an IA is sitting in the virtual classroom but isn't actually supporting a student like they would be if they were in a physical school setting?
That would be a decision and an answer I'd have to provide only after seeing all the facts provided by both the parent and the school division in response to an allegation that a child did not receive appropriate services. That would fall to our ODRAS staff to probably take a look at.
Okay. All right, let me see.
You throwing me some heavy duty questions here.
We have phenomenal parents who ask phenomenal questions, so that's why we're thrilled to have you
and
here.
I'm glad to try and help answer them.
All right, let's see. If a school district could provide a related service in an IEP, like speech or OT, through the virtual setting, but they didn't do so from starting in the spring, should the team address that impact through compensatory or recovery?
Can you ask that again?
Sure. If a school district could provide a related service like speech or OT virtually, but did not, would that fall under compensatory or recovery?
Kind of a loaded question because the word could and did not would be the answer. Could they or couldn't they? I mean, that again is going to be student specific, situation specific, and depending on the outcome of that could be either compensatory or recovery or none. Again, it's all going to be student specific and based on how and why not did that service get provided. I mean, there's a misconception that everything could have been done virtually. And yes, there is some out of the box ways of doing things virtually that, may not have been done initially because it was all new to everybody. But that's not to say that the school could have and didn't. It could be that they couldn't because of the type of services and the protocols associated with it.
Okay. Let me see. If a provider has recommended that a student have fully online or partial online schooling for the fall, I assume that would be, for example, a medical provider. How can parents ensure that this is planned for in advance by the IEP team?
Start that question over.
If a doctor, for example, says that the student needs to be online in the fall, how can parents ensure that it gets planned out for in advance?
Well, what I'm hearing is that a parent has brought in a letter from a doctor saying the child needs homebound services. How that's delivered is up to the IEP team, and it may or may not be through online. It may be through some in-person, it may be through a combination of a hybrid synchronous and asynchronous type learning. Again, that's a kind of a homebound question.
Okay. So at that point, where's the line then between homebound versus opting for virtual in a choice situation?
Homebound is based on a medical documentation by a physician or a clinical psychologist, and virtual learning is determined by the parent and the child's IEP team, or if the school division is saying you as a parent have the option of virtual or not, then the parent's choosing that. That's a choice.
Okay.
A choice that the parent has the ability to change should they desire.
Okay. I think this one is a little bit rhetorical again. The question is, where in federal law are recovery services defined?
They are not. As I mentioned earlier, they are not defined, nor are compensatory services. The only service that I talked about tonight that are defined any kind of way is extended school year.
Okay, but a question I have here is that in 2017, the Department of Education said that kids affected by natural disaster, like hurricanes, should get compensatory services.
And again, I think that's a use of a term that could be equated to recovery.
Okay. Let's see. Special ed parents are overwhelmed with the burden of proof in a normal school year. Will there be an effort to reduce the overwhelming amount of due process cases due to virtual learning?
That would be a question for my ODRAS director to answer.
Okay.
If you send me that one in writing, I'll get you an answer.
Let me highlight that one a totally different color here so that I remember that. Okay. Are recovery services only a thing in Virginia? Is this a federal term?
I won't say it's a federal term, but other states are doing similar type recovery efforts for students that have lost learning due to the COVID.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not unique. The term recovery will pop up in other states, I'm sure.
All right.
I mean, I can't give an example of one, but I'm sure we didn't coin that term all of our own. We may have. We're a leader in a lot of things, so we may have come up with that term, but
okay.
The concept is not unique to Virginia. Let's put it that way.
There we go. I think that you answered this in terms of homebound. Could an LEA provide in-home services if it's appropriate for a student and necessary for a student to access an education?
Yes.
But that would be under homebound in that case?
Could be.
Could it
Again,
also
homebound comes from a medical determination from a doctor or a clinical psychologist.
Okay, so just for confirmation then, does the ADA specifically include home visits?
Could include a home visit.
Okay. Again, depending on
the student, the needs, the situation. Again, I don't think we're doing a lot of in a face-to-face homebound services given the social distancing slash COVID. I think we'll see some changes, obviously, as people start getting vaccinated. But again, the primary goal for everybody through all of this has been what? The safety of them, the staff and the students and the families. So that's always been a priority, which does have an impact on the provision of FAPE that really can't be mediated without putting somebody at risk. So their school may want to do something but can't because of those restrictions. They need to be, able to compensate at some point for that, whether it's through recovery or some other services. But so we don't want to just say we're not going to do any in-home instruction, but we got to be judicious in making sure that it's safe for everybody involved.
And if I just heard you correctly, the piece is, and we shouldn't be forgetting that it was needed and somehow we need to make up for that.
Right. If it was needed and deemed after some time has elapsed and we've looked at the progress of the student, is there a need to recover any lost instructional time or any loss of skill?
Okay. You had mentioned that this is something that should be discussed at IEP meetings. Some families have already had their IEP meeting. So how does a parent go about requesting recovery services for their student? Do they have to call another IEP meeting?
Yeah, they would need to request another IEP meeting. When you say they've already had their IEP meeting, I assume you're talking about their annual.
Exactly.
Yeah, the annual could be the time to look at recovery service, but it may not have been appropriate at that time because there hadn't been enough time to observe the students. So the parents certainly can now say, okay, the child's doing well, but they seem to be falling back on math. Let's talk about, is there a need for recovery services in the math area? Certainly a parent can request an IEP meeting at any time.
Okay.
For any reason.
I don't know that you covered this one earlier. How is data collected to see if a student needs compensatory or recovery services?
The collection of lots of different data sources, information from the parent, information from the student, formal assessments, progress reports, pre-post and during COVID, those type of things. Any kind of data that the team determines would be appropriate. And it could, although it's not recommended, could involve maybe some, especially if an evaluation is out of date, maybe an updated evaluation or something like that, but not recommended because, as we mentioned earlier, it may not be an appropriate method by which you're going to get valid data.
And is the school obligated to share the data they collect with parents?
Certainly. Part of the development of the IEP, the parent has a right to know what data has been used, and they should be informed through the prior written notice what each assessment was that was used. And I'll highlight the word and underline it and bold it, each assessment that was used. It's in the regs. It says description of each assessment. Or words to that effect. I shouldn't be quoting the regs like that, but without double checking, but it's pretty close. It says each assessment that was used.
Okay. Let's see. Ooh, if a student was new to FCPS this school year and never had the opportunity for an in-person assessment, how could parents demonstrate the need for recovery services?
I would think that'd be something that needs to be looked at through the IT team and through the reevaluation process.
Okay.
Because I think we can now do some evaluations in person and even some now can be done virtually. So getting the evaluation done would rest to the school division if they deem it's appropriate.
Okay. And not looking just at academic decline, but the decline in the generalization of skills outside of the home or behavior regulation, can those things or should those things be considered for recovery services?
Well, FAPE includes a child's, social or, all the students' needs. And if they've got issues related to behaviors and, interaction socially, then those things should be considered by the IEP team.
Okay. Speaking then of calling in an IEP meeting to talk about recovery, I think that's going to answer this question. Would the request for recovery services start a 65-day timeline?
No, because recovery services discussion is not an evaluation. Now, if through the discussion of the IEP team they determine an evaluation is needed, then that would trigger the timeline.
So if a parent puts in a request for an IEP meeting because the parent is thinking they want to be discussing recovery services, what is the timeline for the school to respond to hold that IEP meeting?
We traditionally look at it as being a 10 business days, because within 10 business days, you should either provide the parent with a prior written notice as to why you're not going to hold the meeting, or to at least initiate the process of scheduling. And that's not to say it's got to be scheduled within those 10 days, but one of those things, two things should occur within that 10-day window, because we talk about prior written notice to be given on a denial or a refusal. And there could be some discussion as to, well, we haven't refused anything yet, so why do we need to provide a prior written notice? Well, you can't sit on a request forever, and if you're not going to do the evaluation, then you should at least let the parent know why and what the next step would be.
Okay. Can parents ask for recovery services now?
Yes, I mean, they can, because the guidance does not prescribe that you must wait X amount of time. It says after a duration of time. And the IEP team is the one that would determine whether that's appropriate. And if the school division does decline to hold a meeting because they believe not enough time has passed, then they would definitely be, wanting to provide the prior written notice, say we're refusing to hold the IEP meeting, and the reason is, and the data we used was, and the other things we consider were, all those requirements of a prior written notice should be provided to the parent.
And for decisions for recovery services, do they or should they differ depending on whether a student is returning physically to school or staying virtual for the remainder of the year?
I'm going to use the word appropriate. The IEP team determine what is appropriate and how those services are going to look and how long they're going to be, how much, and so on. Okay. So yeah, it falls back to the appropriate needs of the child.
Okay, let me see. All right, I'm not sure if this has been clarified through the earlier questions. It says, please clarify, is it up to the parent to ask for recovery services and prove their child needs those services, even though their IEPs have not been followed during COVID?
The parent doesn't have to prove anything. They need to present the information that they have, and the school division needs to respond to their concern, and how they do that will give the parent what they need to either consider moving forward with either mediation, a state complaint, or a due process hearing. I mean, parents need to provide as much documentation as they have to support their allegation or concern, but they're in no position to have to provide proof. Now, if you go to a due process, often the burden of proof falls on the person bringing the due process hearing. But we're not talking about a due process. We're talking about a request for an IEP meeting and discussion of services. So they don't have to come in prepared to prove my child needs it. Here's why I believe it. What are you doing to address it? What can we do to address it? And the school provision provides there.
Okay.
I see a comment by somebody that says the burden of proof begins in the IEP. I'm not sure what that comment means, but I might agree that the IEP sets the basis for what is required, and therefore there's the proof. This is what should have been provided. It wasn't, here's my supporting documentation, but the parent doesn't need to go on and on about, making a case. Hey, you didn't provide it, and then the school division would need to say, yes, we did. Here's our documentation. At least that's how it would work in a formal complaint. I would think in a collaborative situation that would be the same. And if you can't reach resolution through collaboration, then you move to the more formalized methods.
And I don't know if this is redundant or not, because my head is sort of spinning. But the question that also popped up here is significant regression required, or can just a lack of progress qualify a student?
Remember, regression is about an extended school year. Lack of progress could be what impacts on the need for recovery services. In other words, the student isn't making the progress that we expected them they would have made had there been instruction during the time of the COVID impact.
Okay. What, if anything, does the quality of services play in? For example, OT over the internet is much less effective than in person. I imagine it has to
That
do
would
with
be,
outcome.
I'm going to say that would go back to, is the child receiving what they should be receiving to receive a free, appropriate public education? And that discussion would fall to the IEP team and or eventually the mediation or a due process hearing. I hate to keep going back to that, but
It's fine.
you know, sometimes that's the answer that I've got to give because that's the answer that's appropriate.
And like I said, I'm not even be able to keeping track in my head anymore if I'm asking the same question over and over. So
I don't mind. And again, I want to stress that we don't want parents having to file due process. We want parents to be able to resolve issues at the lowest level possible. And that is where my office was one initially created, was to be able to provide a parents with a source of getting information. Our parent ombudsman role now has been expanded to being able to not only speak with parents, but to reach out directly to LEAs and try to help both parties massage the issue at the lower level. And then if ultimately we can't reach it through collaboration, then we need to inform parents that they do have other options to proceed with. And we try to, you know, take them a step by step, not that they have to be following any kind of order, but mediation is probably the most cost effective because it is free and it's also the easiest to get scheduled. And there's a high probability you're going to come out with an agreement you can both agree to. State complaints about 50-50, and it's a lengthy process, 60 days. And then the due process, again, is not as cost effective and certainly doesn't takes a while to get scheduled and then takes hearing, and, you know, it takes a while to get a decision. So it's the longest process as well. So if you're looking to get quick return, you want to work with that IEP team and make your case as best you can and get them to show what they're doing. And if you agree, great. If not, you continue to work. And when you can't, you step to the next level.
Okay.
You're glad all this is recorded, right? You can go back and listen to it on your.
Oh, yeah. All right. When you're looking at documentation, and for example, school is saying, well, the kid is meeting their goals. Well, what if the reason for that is because the school changed the goals because the kid wasn't making progress?
Well, did the school change the goals or did the IEP team change the goal?
And did you agree to those changes that were proposed by the school?
Did you provide your consent for those changes as a parent? Yes.
Okay. What do you do when data that a parent has kept at home differs from the data that the school is keeping? And the example in the question is with attendance, for example. So the school, we can go on to the school system and see which classes our kids missed. So if a parent knows that their kid is skipping school, but it's not noted in the school system, so the data differs between home and school, how do you remedy those two things?
I would address that with the local school administration.
And say, I know my kid's been skipping school and the attendance is not reflecting it?
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, it's a question that is valid that, you know, you're saying my kid has been in class, or the reverse would be true sometimes. Well, you're saying my kid wasn't in class and I know he was. I was sitting there with him. I mean, it becomes, you know, what evidence do we have? And if the kid was absent, the kid was absent, and, you know, you really have to deal with that correctly. Okay. But that's like in the principal administrative level, probably start there and then move it up the chain.
Okay. Can recovery services be considered if a parent made the decision to keep their child virtual while school was physically open for special ed students?
Possibly. Again, that would be a decision to be made by the IEP team. Was there an impact due to the option of being in virtual? And is virtual working? That might need to be reconsidered if that's the issue.
And if the decision to be virtual was the parent's decision?
I still think that if the parent now believes that virtual is not working, or there needs to be some modification, and they certainly have a right to have an IEP meeting to talk about any necessary accommodations, modifications, or a change back to at least some in-person instruction instead of all virtual, or back to all in-person.
I think the question is actually almost the opposite. What if the parent is saying, I'm not comfortable with this COVID stuff, I'm keeping my kid at home, and the school says, well, we're offering it here at school, and the parent says, well, I don't want to send my kid to school right now. Can recovery services be considered?
I would think an IEP team would have to at least address that from an IEP team perspective.
Okay. A little more concrete.
Let me stop. Can I?
Yes.
I do some of the questions pop in chat, and I just saw one from Norman Hall. You know, he said that this is great when parents have the capacity and ability to advocate for their children, but the understanding is that the Dept is concerned about all children who are getting special ed in Fairfax. This is why I am concerned about staff experience. What can you say about this part of our population? I can't address a specific population, but I would agree that yes, some parents don't have the same capacity, ability, don't have the knowledge to effectively advocate for themselves. And I'm going to say again, that's why my office is there to help the parent learn a little bit more and help them advocate, provide them with some guidance. The parent ombudsman can now certainly make a connection with the school division. And then we also have access to other resources that we can refer the parent to for free, low-cost legal services and or guidance from a more professional level. Because contrary to popular belief, I'm not an attorney, so I can't make determinations of law and say that the law, I've been accused many times of practicing law without a license, but it's the idea that everybody needs to be working together and educating parents. And that's also why my office now has a new coordinator for family engagement whose responsibilities is going to be working with LEAs on how they can more effectively work with parents and make sure parents are getting the information they need to be able to actively and appropriately engage in their child's education. And that's, you know, we got school divisions that do a great job. We got schools that do a mediocre job. We got some school divisions that need some additional guidance and support. So we determined that we needed to have somebody to do that. And Tracy Lee is now heading up those efforts, and we'll be reaching out and talking with advocacy groups such as yourself about, you know, what are you seeing as the needs and stuff like that. So we're wanting to help school divisions as well as parents learn to collaborate and work together to resolve issues at the lowest level. And the way we do that is make parents understand that. And oftentimes I've had to tell a parent, hey, you can wish all you want, but the regulations provide a bar that has to be met, and it may not be as high as you want it to be. The key is you can always ask, is that bar appropriate for my child? And how do you bring that forward? So that's what we're wanting to continue to do.
Will Tracy be only responding to LEAs that request help, or is she pushing out, so to speak?
Well, we're going to be pushing it out as an initiative from the department. We're not going to go to one LEA and say, you need help. That's not the intent. It's, hey, we're going to develop these programmings. We're going to provide this initiative. And certainly we have had school divisions reach out and say, hey, can you help us with this? Can you do these kind of things? We've had LEAs invite me to do presentations, or my office do presentations at their LEA or through their SEAC, because they want to help get information to parents. And Fairfax has done that on occasions in years past. And I think they'll continue to do that and be responsive. I mean, it's a service we're going to offer, and we're not in a position to force anyone to take that. It's training, and it'll be available to anybody that wants to avail themselves to it.
So to tag up on that, in terms of working with Tracy, if we at SEPTA are hearing about these issues, can we reach out to her and say, this is a recurring issue that we're hearing in Fairfax County, or is she not?
No, that would be an issue to bring up with Gloria Dalton or myself.
Okay.
I
Got
mean,
it.
Tracy will respond to those, but she's going to be more focused on development of the trainings and working on some other initiatives with family engagement. Gloria Dalton, or the parent ombudsman's role, has changed a little bit due to the JLARC. I mean, we've been doing most of what JLARC had recommended. We're putting out more information about how to reach the ombudsman and what her true role is. I mean, most of the parents that were interviewed said they'd never heard of the ombudsman, but if they'd asked if they knew who Gloria was, they probably would have said yes. So we're making it known that we have a parent ombudsman. It just has to be Gloria Dalton at the present time. So I would bring any systemic concerns or thoughts to Gloria's attention. And as part of that, we're going to be reviewing all that and sharing it, any systemic issues that we see with our ODRAS staff and with Dr. Hollins and cabinet level administrators. So we are going to be taking a little bit more look. And thank you, Sherry, for defining what JLARC means.
And the idea of ombudsman, I also just want to mention for our audience, hopefully you have heard from us pushing out information, but Fairfax County does also have an ombudsman who is specifically assigned to be working with special education families. So you are always welcome to go local to our local special ed ombudsman, in addition to or before or after the state as well.
And I believe Gloria has had some conversations with that individual in the past. And one of the things that we're asking her to do is to reach out and see if there are other divisions that have an ombudsman or something similar within their division, so we can kind of coordinate some of our efforts through that as well.
All right. We are getting through our questions. We only have a smallish handful of them left. You have a few more minutes to keep at it?
Sure.
Oh, thank you. All right.
I just gotta get done so I can go hang out with Home and Garden TV with my wife. I'm just joking. No, I'm here for you. Whatever it takes, whatever time we need to take, I'm willing to give to you tonight. That's what we're here for.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. This is a more concrete example question. What are some examples of recovery services?
Again, I don't collect that kind of data because, one, it would be individualized, and there's 73,000 students out there identified as needing special ed services within the county. Probably more than that. I'm using a number that I remember. But so I don't collect any student specific data. But again, I'm going to go back to the adage of whatever is appropriate to a student is what should be considered. And there's nothing in the regs that say it can only be this, it can only be that, it can only be this much, it can only be that much. It's what is determined appropriate by the team.
Okay. Assuming that, I think that you've answered this, assuming informal dispute resolution procedures do not result in agreement, do due process hearing officers and federal courts have jurisdiction over recovery services disputes?
They have a right to address the child's need for FAPE, and that could be the determination that certain services should have been provided. And normally from a due process hearing, you're going to see compensatory services. Same with a state complaint. They're not going to say, well, it should have been recovery, but they could say that the child was denied FAPE, therefore the IEP team needs to convene to discuss should get compensatory or recovery or some other type of remedy.
Okay. This is an interesting question because you have really, I think, expanded for many people what might potentially qualify for recovery and or compensatory services. And we're talking about a lot of kids. So what if the impact on students is really widespread? What happens?
Well, that'll be something that we need to look at as we determine that, and as data starts reflecting that, this COVID really had an impact, what decisions need to be made at our level. Again, you got to remember the department can only enforce laws and regulations that are currently in place and then provide guidance on how to ensure that those are carried out or to assist school divisions in carrying out those requirements. And we certainly would take a look. I'm sure that if the data is saying that this was so widespread and so impactful, what else do we need to consider? What other guidance should we be providing? But right now, I think it's still a little early from my perspective. And again, I'm not in a cabinet level position, so I'm not involved in every data dump that they look at with regards to all of this stuff. But I'm sure we are taking a look at, what is the impact, and eventually going to have to address it in some fashion. Or not. Maybe we're going to find that the impact has been taken care of at the school division level. And we've got some students that were impacted, and they may need more services. And there's nothing to say recovery services have to be completed by the end of this year. I mean, the guidance doesn't talk about when the services stop. Same thing with compensatory. They don't say the IEP team determines the duration. And even if the IEP team says that recovery services are going to go from here to here, now is if we continue through that, we're not seeing that the students picking up on the progress, that the IEP team could not extend it even further. So nothing that says it's got to be, again, minute for minute, day for day, or I would even expand that to say, year to year.
So an interesting question just came up then, and I'm actually looking for clarification on it. What if a military family moves and the child needs recovery services? So I guess the question could go either way. What if it's determined that a kid needs recovery services and then the family moves away? Or what if it's determined elsewhere that the kid needs recovery services and then they move here?
Both the state and federal special education laws and regulations address transfer students. And both recovery services, compensatory services, and extended school year services are IEP team decisions, therefore IEP driven. Therefore, a student leaving Virginia to go into Texas, for example, with recovery services outlined in their IEP, then Texas would have to apply the transfer regulations and take a look at it. And the reverse would be true for a student coming into Virginia. And again, the transfer regs do provide some flexibility for providing comparable services.
All right. I'm curious to hear your answer for this one.
This ain't the question we were talking about at the beginning of the meeting when I signed in. Okay.
But I'm curious about that one too, but we'll set that aside for now. Please provide an example or two of regression that would be suitable for recovery services. How much regression is enough regression? How do you measure? How do you determine when regression has happened?
Well, being I am not a member of a child's IEP team, it was very difficult for me to say that even in a hypothetical situation, because looking at how much regression is taking place is going to be based on the individual student data and what is the anticipated need, and that is all individual based. So for me to give examples would be very difficult to do, and I don't think I'd want to give people examples to use and go, Hank said we should be asking for regression services because ESY service because of this. Not that people do that, but I don't want to predetermine what might qualify as a service.
Well, I think that right there in your answer, you just threw out the key word there in terms of predetermination, that there isn't a predetermined, true or false, a predetermined level by which it said, okay, that's enough, you now get XYZ.
Correct. There is no parameters established in any of our guidance that says a child has to be at this percentage of regression or not to qualify for extended school year.
And would the same also then apply for recovery and or compensatory services?
Correct. It's going to be determined by the IEP team. What was the direct impact on this student given this situation? We failed to provide 25 minutes a day of services for 3 weeks. What's the impact? We weren't able to provide 25 minutes of services for 3 weeks. What is the impact? One would be compensatory, one would probably be recovery. Call them what you want. I mean, those terms can be used interchangeable all day long. It's the difference is making, you don't want to put the school division on well, you failed to do it. Well, we couldn't do it. We were closed. We couldn't do it. We couldn't provide that service because the protocol doesn't allow us to do it in a virtual environment. We can't do that assessment in a virtual environment. We have to do it in person. And right now we just are not capable of doing that given the safety and security requirements. Now, again, a lot of that is loosened up. So things should be, I won't say back to normal, because I don't think we're going to be back to a full normal in quite a long time, but should be able to do a little bit more than what we were able to do at the onset of the COVID. Certainly things have improved to the point where with safety precautions, things can be done that weren't done in the beginning. That is an opinion. That is not guidance from the department. That's Hank throwing out.
When we've said like there isn't a magic formula to say or a magic cutoff point, it's not like you're taking, let's say, the same data on an assessment and saying, well, it only changed this much, so therefore you don't get, versus it changed this much, so you do get.
Well, and I think the IDA is clear, and as are the Virginia regulations, that you should not be relying on one piece of data regardless. So if you've only got one piece and you're relying on that, you need to probably look at what else supports that or doesn't support it.
Okay.
And then making the decision based on that.
Okay. I'm going to throw out another question. We have our interpreters for a few more minutes. I want to make sure I get this in. But I think that you sort of answered it. Regarding asynchronous days, how are those counted toward the total number of days in school? I think that you said that just depends on the local school system and how they're.
Correct. It's how are they counting and how are they satisfying the 180 and 90, what is it, 180 and 90 numerals that they use.
So there isn't any state regulation guidance that says if you have an asynchronous day, that's allowed to count as a day or it's not allowed to count as a day?
I believe that's discussed in our recovery document, but I'd have to verify, highlight that one and send that one to me too.
Okay. Hold on one sec. Let me do that.
The well runs deep, but sometimes I got to go a little deeper with the bucket.
Let me see. The recovery document that you're referring to, someone just asked, is?
It's in resources, our document, recovery, redesign, and what is it? Recovery, restart, recovery, restart, redesign, recovery, the 3R document. It's the second one on the list of the resource documents that I provided.
Okay.
It's quite lengthy, but it's got a lot of great information. And if you use the table of contents, you can quickly find where you want to go.
And I know that I think Amanda said we're going to post the link. I know that I've come upon it too. I think if you Google VDOE recovery, it pops up.
You type in recovery service, it'll be the second thing that comes up, or at least when I pulled it the other day, that's when it came up.
All right, there we go. Okay, believe it or not, I think I have run through the 40 some questions that we were able to capture. And I'm looking to see, and Amanda, or if there's anyone else from our board who's been helping with copying and pasting questions or tracking, are there any additional questions that we missed?
I do not see any other ones.
Well,
wow.
And let me say this, if you get more, you can certainly send them to me in an email or as a Word attachment to an email. And if there's anybody out there that has a specific question that they want to ask and didn't feel comfortable asking in this environment, they can shoot me an email directly and I will answer it or get somebody that can answer it for you. I don't want anybody to have questions that go unanswered based on my information, especially if I provided something that made it more fuzzy for you. Because I know sometimes I do talk quickly and try to cover. I know I throw a lot more information in print than I say. So if you look at that and you're trying to compare to what I said and you've got confusion, please reach out and ask me to clarify for you what my intent was.
I'm going to ask everybody, don't jump off. Wait for just a minute after we wrap up here and say thank yous, because we do want to throw up our poll about our nominating committee. So just tossing that out there too. So Hank, definitely want to say huge thank yous. I am very much looking forward to rewatching this and sitting down and really digesting all this information. We've had many questions coming into our Facebook group discussion over the past, long time, and more of them more recently. So I'm really appreciative of being able to consult with you and toss some interesting and hard questions your way. And I always appreciate your candor, both in terms of the answers you give and when you don't know. Thank you for, being upfront about that as well. It's something I certainly always appreciate.
Yeah, this is such a fluid situation that sometimes the answers change, and it's an ever-changing environment. And I've got a couple emails from people saying, I think one to clarify for me what our stance is on school closures. So I'm gonna look at that real close and see what I might have missed or may have misinterpreted for somebody. So it's a learning experience for me to hear new things and hear what's going on, not just in one school division, because one school division is probably just the tip of the iceberg of what we're really encountering across the divisions. I mean, Fairfax is so large, but some of the issues you're facing are certainly the same that are happening out in little counties like Allegheny and out there in Wise County and out there in the southern southwest tip of Virginia, and vice versa. They're encountering things that you guys are going to encounter in such a large division. So it's always a pleasure to get out and try to clarify for parents. And I know there were some school division folks on here probably listening, and if I've said anything that they have any concerns or thoughts about, they certainly can reach out to me and we can talk about them as well. But I think the information I provided was straightforward and came from those resources, except for the one instance where I said that is truly my opinion. And I try to do that. I usually say that it's a Hankism if that's what it is, because I don't want anybody going back and saying, well, the VDOE's position is, no, it was mine. And I will stand on it and say, yeah, I said that. But, if I've misled anybody or said anything that was totally incorrect, I would hope somebody would point it out to me. But I researched this very thoroughly and talked it over with several people, make sure the information I was putting out did comport to what we are still saying in our guidance, because some of it is old. I mean, it was right at the beginning of COVID, and we have updated much of it, but some of the language was, this is really pre-COVID language, but it does still apply. So I just wanted to, again, thank you for inviting me to do this, and thank you for all your work as an advocacy group and as a PTA. And I've always enjoyed talking with people from Fairfax. So
thank you. We certainly treasure you, and thinking about all the families and people that you can touch through the whole state. You are truly a state treasure. So thank you very
Thank you for
much
those kind words. And I'm going to be around for a few more years, I think,
Good.
unless I get a better job offer somewhere else. But I don't know if that'll ever happen. But I really enjoy what I'm doing, and I think it comes through in my work with parents, that they can really see that I'm there to support them, but I also have to be the one to tell them, hey, you might need to take a deep breath, because what I'm going to tell you isn't what you want to hear. So
absolutely. Appreciate it. All right.
All
right.
right.
Well, Hank, have a wonderful night.
You too. And y'all enjoy the rest of you're going to do your voting or whatever. So have a great time with that. All right. Y'all have a great
your home and garden. So
I throw that out as a funny joke every now and then, but I got really nothing to do. In fact, I'm going to be back to checking email actually. So y'all have a great night. Thanks again.
Thanks, Hank. All right. You too.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.